Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar here at the Royal United Services Institute. I'm really pleased to welcome you. I'm Dr. Jessica White. I'm the Senior Research Fellow on the Terrorism and Conflict team. And we're today having the second webinar. I'm really pleased to have the second webinar today, and that's part of our program focused on looking at far-right extremism and terrorism. Today, we'll be discussing expressions of far rights in Latin America and the connections both to right-wing politics across the continent, as well as the connection to transnational far-right ecosystem and connections to other local contexts around the globe. Just a few housekeeping things to get us started, and then I'll turn us over to our excellent panel of experts. This event is on the record and is being recorded. The recording will be available after the event, so you can feel free to share. We will use the Q&A box today, so please do put your questions in there that you have for the panel. It will be a discussion format today, so there'll be plenty of opportunity to engage, and I think we'll have a really rich discussion about the topics. I'll come back at the end of the session today to wrap up the discussion and to conclude, but for now, I'm excited to introduce to you today our moderator, Dr. Carlos Solar, who is our Senior Research Fellow on Latin American Security in our International Securities Studies group here at RUSI. Carlos, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, Jessica, and hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today with Feliciano and with Andresa, who have kindly joined us to discuss not just Brazil, but far-right and extremism and political extremism in Latin America, which I think it's a great case study, a regional case study with differences, of course, but it will definitely be an interesting session, and I'm very keen to hear any comments from the attendees. Please use the Q&A box to send comments and questions that I'll be asking Andres and Feliciano. So without further ado, I think I'll jump straight into the questions. And I guess we all saw what happened with the transition of power in Brazil last month in January. I think the images were quite revealing and impactful, but I think it wasn't a surprise. So I think my first question to Andresa is basically to say, were you surprised at all with what happened in the streets of Brazil with the transition of power? I mean, it was big, hundreds of thousands of people all over the country. But in a way, we actually have the legacy of Bolsonaro, and this could have been probably expected on what's happened in the streets. But Andresa, please, I'm very happy to have you with us, and go ahead. What were your first impressions on those early days in January?
Hello, everybody. Hello, Carlos. Thank you so much for the invitation. Professor Feliciano, it's a pleasure to share the floor with you. I find this a very difficult question. I am myself from Brasilia. So this is the place where I, used to drive every day, where my family works, where so many of my colleagues work. So on a personal level, yes, I was surprised to see the amount of vandalism and violence. But as you said, like on a political analysis, this was all building up. The approach of former President Bolsonaro to really motivate the crowds to be against the institutions, to take some form of revenge, like to revisit what had been the elections in Brazil, to protest against the results, his silence about the results, like never conceiving, never saying that he lost the elections, that the results should be accepted, not saying anything at all, not passing on the presidential we say faixa, like really the symbol of the presidency, not passing that to Lula, he being alone, like to take power by himself. All of that was encouraging his followers who were already radicalized, who had been camping outside the military headquarters all over Brazil to really do something. People were interpreting his silencing the way they wanted. There was a lot of fake news of Bolsonaro really mean that these symbols, this t-shirt he's wearing means this. Like, people were interpreting silence in so many ways, and then saying that he can't say that we should invade, otherwise he's going to be persecuted, he's going to respond for that in court, but what he really means is that we should invade. So there was all of that building up. In that sense, it's difficult to be surprised by those actions.
Thank you, Andresa. Andresa is currently based at at San Anthony's in Latin America, at the Latin American Center in Oxford, but she'll move on to direct the Brazil Institute at King's. So I recommend you follow her work. And now we jump to Feliciano, who's an associate professor of international relations at the University of Sao Paulo. So Feliciano, probably the same question to you. What were your first impressions being in Brazil and feeling firsthand the events on the streets?
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here at RUSI. It's a pleasure to share the panel with Dr. Andresa, whose work I use in my own personal work. Just like Andresa mentioned, I was in Sao Paulo here. I was really surprised. I was not expecting that such vandalism would occur in Brasilia. I have been studying Bolsonaro's foreign policy, as I'm going to mention later on, for quite some time. I was studying how Bolsonaro was built up in international coalitions of far-right movements, and I was also trying to understand how important Brazil was for these far-right movements, and how much it was similar to what we saw in January in the United States during the transition of the government in the United States. So. But on the other hand, there was so much talk of the town that they were going to do something similar like that. I was not so much surprised for what they did, but I was very much surprised by how the political authorities reacted or not reacted to the vandalism. Right? I was not hoping that the security of the palace of the president, and I was not hoping that the military specifically would either stop or not do anything. It was very easy to stop all that crowd. And Brasilia, Andresa is from Brasilia, she knows very well, Brasilia was designed to be very difficult for crowds to invade any government facility, because the squares are huge. The government area, you have to have huge crowds to be able to overcome any security forces. And in the past, many times crowds similar to those from the left and from the right were manifesting there, and nothing of this magnitude happened. So I was really shocked by the security forces reacted or not reacted. Brazil has a flaw, a constitutional flaw, is a flaw in the constitution about the security of the government. When Brasilia was founded in the 60s, instead of creating a federal police responsible for protecting state buildings in the capital, they gave the authority to the governor of Brasilia to do so, the governor of the federal district. And the governor of the federal district police is funded by the federal government. They have a higher salary than the average salary of police in Brazil. So they are actually not the military, but the police of the federal district are responsible for the protection of the palaces. So, the design is so bad that all you needed was a radicalized crowd and a governor in the opposition. And so that what happened. The governor of Brasilia was in the opposition of Lula. And there was some problem within the administration of his own department, security department, that allowed that to happen. So in order to have that sort of thing happen, either in the United States and Brazil, you have to, it's a multi-cause problem, right? You have to have several things combined together to be able to, that to happen. So from a political science perspective, I was, of course, me studying Bolsonaro, I was like sad again to see all that, but I was not surprised. But I was really surprised by how the security authorities did not react or reacted in a bad. Now there is a lot of investigations going on. Let's see if they're going to punish the responsible, both within the military police of the federal district and also in the army, because the army, I mean, is the first time in Brazil's history, if I'm not mistaken, that there is an invasion of the palace of the president, Palácio do Planalto, where the president works. And there is an army troop that stays 24/7 in that palace, responsible to protect it. And the army, and that is an army, it's not actually federal, that's only for the palace. And they did not act. They actually, there are some speculations that some of them might have allowed people to enter the palace. But then the problem becomes huge, because now you have a problem with the security forces and how to tackle this issue. So we've been 54 days or so in the new government. There's a lot to happen still in Brazil concerning the terrible day, but that is a shame, and it's a shame that we're going to carry for a very long time in Brazilian politics.
Thanks for that, Feliciano. I think we're going to talk plenty on civil-military relations and security actors, especially with recent declarations from active and retired generals on what Lula's winning the presidency has meant for the country. So back to you, Andresa. So you published in 2020 an article on politics and gender, which is a good representation, I think, of the work you do, which is very interdisciplinary. You don't stay within anthropology, but you jump into political science and sociology, and even, you know, feminist studies, which can actually fall in any of those three. So this article in 2020 that I mentioned, for those of you that haven't seen it, it kind of like preempted this backlash against minorities and against the social rights, especially by this strong right-wing movement. But it was published in 2020, Andresa. So we are now in 2023. What will be a second part of this paper if you were, or if you are writing something like this?
Thanks, Carlos. Okay, so thanks for mentioning the paper. The paper Carlos is talking about discusses this backlash on social rights and how usually social rights, they advance majority, like most of the times by the left, that pushes, you know, like same-sex marriage, or at least some of the discussions, although it's not really decided in the parliament, some of the draft laws are usually advanced by left-wing parties, left-wing politicians. So these politicians, they tend to be very associated with some of these agendas. And then there is a backlash, because then usually this advance perhaps faster than what society at large wants, which is still a very conservative society in Brazil, and then society moves towards the left as if they are against the family and they are against the rights. So what happened in Brazil very specifically is that before, when you had any advance on social rights, this was always disputed in the sense that, okay, we don't want abortion, or we don't want same-sex marriage. But what started to happen around 2013 was that any advance in social rights was not perceived as advancement on social rights, was perceived as a threat against the others, against the majority. So as if abortion threatens the right to life, as if same-sex marriage threatens heterosexual marriage. So, and then you start seeing like draft laws such as the Day of Heterosexual Pride, or something like that. As if you have to defend heteronormative relationships, you have to defend the family, and there is a threat, and there is this moral panic in Brazilian society. So this was building up, and Bolsonaro's administration was a very strong backlash against social rights, because it was very based on this idea that there is a threat, there is a panic, and we need to protect the family against this threat. And this threat was very represented by the left. Now that the left is in power, I think the biggest difference is in relation to the far right, is that this idea that social rights is not only for deserving individuals, for individuals that are heteronormative, that are profound, but social rights is for society at large. So now they're trying, and I think one of the first actions is we see now with the Yanomamis, with some indigenous groups in Brazil that were left behind, that were in situations of genocide, that are now being brought to the fore. So I guess a continuation of this article would be, can a government really revert these aspects that was happening in society against this backlash? Of course, in policies, they need to incorporate like human rights back to the agenda, but in society, is that like easily reversible? And is this backlash going to continue, this time not through the government, but through some sorts of social movements? I have the feeling that governments and politicians still play a very big role. And the speech of racism, the speech against minorities by Bolsonaro empowered society to go against these groups. This being out of the scene, I think it's more difficult for some of these backlash movements, these rights rollback movements to mobilize. That said, I think we need to see in which ways some of these counter movements, some of these backlash movements, they will still be able to mobilize and counter social rights.
Thank you, Andressa. Feliciano, if we put Andressa's analysis into comparative perspective, and just because I know that the recent paper on international affairs, which I also recommend everyone to read, on how far-right populist ideas travel, did they travel, or were they rooted elsewhere in Latin America that could find echo to this, far-right, violent or maybe non-violent movements, but far-right anyway within the region?
I muted myself. Thank you, Carlos. I need to go back to the 2018 election in Brazil to answer your questions and to give you some context, right? After Bolsonaro's victory, I decided to create here at University of São Paulo a research group on the news government foreign policy. And after 4 years, we have published several articles, including the one on international affairs and many others. And we are now working on a book that will summarize what it was Bolsonaro's foreign policy in the last 4 years. But we also created maybe the most extensive database on Bolsonaro's foreign policy. We have gathered more than 3,000 speeches from several cabinet members on foreign policy issues, and we are now reaching up to 55 million original tweets of Bolsonaristas on Twitter, on tweets on foreign affairs issues. And I hope by the end of this year, we will make available to everyone to consult this massive database on appropriate website that we are trying to get some funding here in Brazil. And to study Bolsonaro's foreign policy, we had to focus on specific subjects or issues of Brazil foreign policy and then see how they changed compared to the previous administrations. The piece published in International Affairs is about the international identity of Bolsonaro's foreign policy. But as for Bolsonaro's foreign policy on Latin America, towards Latin America, we published a book chapter recently entitled From Regional Leader to Regional Antagonist, Bolsonaro's Anti-South American Stance During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And the chapter analyzes how Bolsonaro perceives Latin America, South America, and the Brazilian neighborhood. And we show that for his administration, leftist leaders dominate the Brazilian neighborhood, and that the future of Brazil does not lie on having close relationship with the region. And something that goes against the history of Brazil's foreign policy. For his administration, Latin America is a matter of security, defense, drug traffic, and border issues, and is an economic it is an economic opportunity, and it is not an economic opportunity or even an area where Brazil should exert some influence, on contrary to all Brazilian previous administrations. So this perception only changes when there is a right-wing leader governing some Latin American country. In the case of Macri in Argentina or Sebastián Piñera in Chile, for example. Although these presidents do not fit into typical categories of right-wing populists, the fact that they are right-wing and pro-market would make it easier for Bolsonaro to show some support or even some interest. In fact, Bolsonaro's favorite politicians in the region were those somewhat similar to his own populist right-wing profile. And these are José Antonio Cast in Chile and Javier Milei in Argentina. These leaders are very close to Bolsonaro's family, specifically Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, who is the leader of Brazil's regional policy towards right-wing movements. So you asked me about the idea of if the ideas travel, right? If Bolsonaro is able to influence the rest of Latin America. We have to realize that, as we pointed out in our international affairs paper, that Bolsonaro's significant other is Donald Trump, the US conservative movement, and not any other right-wing Latin American leader. Bolsonaro has never looked at other Latin American leaders as a role model or as an inspiration, right? They base their relationship with the American conservative movement on a race issue, and not only on family values. So in this regard, Latin American people, whether they are Chileans, Argentinians, or Bolivians and Colombians, they can never be Brazil's role model simply because in Bolsonaristas' eyes, they are not white and conservative enough. So for Brazil, as I said before, Brazil's future lies in Israel. But to answer your questions more directly, the rise or fall of any far-right movement in Latin America will always depend on how Bolsonaro's movement is strong in Brazil. No other far-right movement in Latin America can attract far-right parties or leaders in Brazil. And Brazilians just don't look at them for inspiration, but the reverse is true. Far-right movements in other parts of Latin America look up for Bolsonaro. Far-right groups in Brazil are far larger than all other far-right groups in Latin American countries combined. Just some example, Brazilians and American groups and speakers dominate CPAC meetings, one of the meetings of conservative movements worldwide. For example, when we search for 10 typical far-right words on Twitter, in Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian, especially those words related to globalism, which is a far-right conspiracy for international affairs, the vast majority of them, 90% of them, are written in Portuguese, even though there are way more Hispanic people using Twitter than Brazilians or Portuguese. So Bolsonaro is the hub of the far-right movement in Latin America. So if you find other far-right movements in Argentina or Chile or Colombia or Bolivia, which is a close case to Brazil, or Paraguay, even Uruguay, they will rely on the position that Bolsonaro is having in Brazil. So the hub is Brazil. I will talk about that a little bit more later on, but this is just to have you in mind that when you talk about conservative movements in Latin America, Brazil is the place to look at, either by numbers or by the sheer power of what was Bolsonaro's administration for 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Feliciano. No, I think that that idea that Brazil clearly looks up outside of the region rather than looking inward, it's not just part of Bolsonarism. I mean, Lula also looked for the BRICS outside of the region, right? Because they gave him another platform for foreign policy. So I think Brazilians on the left or on the right, they tend to look up to other players that might be on the same size or on the same league, but that's just a foreign policy type of decision. But I'll come back to that later. I think we've touched on the figures of leaders, right? We've spoken about Lula and about Jair Bolsonaro per se, but what if we go to the grassroots movements, Andresa? So what do you think, when you mentioned that Lula might revert this backlash, but by strengthening, you know, a legislative agenda towards rights, okay? So what about grassroots? Will he be able in the next 4 years to actually change how people think, how these grassroots movements think about, you know, what's Brazilian identity and what the hetero, the normative, the conservative has to stay within Brazilian values rather than a left-wing agenda that wants, you know, change these values. So I think the conversation has at least 2 levels, one being what authorities say and one being whether they will be able to deliver or not.
Thanks, Carlos. Talking about civil society and movements at large is difficult because it's so pulverized. So if we break it down, let's say the church, you know, religious movements, because a lot of the conservative agenda was coming from religious movements. And again, here is so pulverized because if you think of the evangelicals, Pentecostals, that's a very diverse group. But thinking about that, the key leaders of the largest Pentecostal church in Brazil, they have called their followers to back up the election results. So we see many evangelical pastors from the largest church that are actually, even though they had a speech before that Lula is the evil and that this is an election of the good against the bad, after the results, they were like, okay, like this is the result and we have to accept that. A smaller church, however, which doesn't mean that these people are not influential because you have leaders of smaller churches that actually have huge crowds in their social media platforms. They have been the ones that are still more radical. So if we think of, for example, a church as a sign of social movement or organized movement as a sort of force in society that is more conservative, then I think the largest churches, that the ones that tend to enter politics, they are less radicalized now without Bolsonaro. And that's very clear from their posts on social media. That's very clear from their trying to deflate, they're trying to diminish this sort of violence and antagonism feeling that was happening amongst the congregations, especially because for some of these congregations, to be in opposition is not part of their agenda. Like it's not good for business to be in the opposition, but it's also thinking of Bible versicles and so on. It's very clear in their faith that every government is established by God, and by definition they should just follow and obey and back it up. So a lot of these churches have diminished the confrontation, but obviously talking about social movements in Brazil will mean a very complex discussion because there are many of them. So this is just one example. I do think it extends to more examples. I think that the political momentum, and to think that the police was with them, to think that the military was with them, to think that they could say racist statements, that they could be against rights and they wouldn't be punished, that they would be backed by the president. I think that empowered some of these counter movements very much, and they will know that this is no longer the case. It's already happening. Some of them are already being punished. So I think there is potentially less of that, at least, how can I say, in the open in Brazilian society for now. And the issue of grassroots movements also on the left, that was very strong in Lula's administration, and Latin America is actually famous for its protests, its social movements, often like for inclusion, like for improvements in urban affairs and so on. So that's another thing that we need to see how civil society movements, the very right claims movements, not right in taking away, but right claims movements, how do we organize themselves now that they have a president that is famously on the left in power, but usually they can be perceived as confrontational, as antagonizing, because they're claiming rights, they're claiming for more. Will they still, mobilize and organize, or will they just wait until Lula calms down? We see that, for example, with strikes, from teachers, from university professors. Will they, wait and, postpone and strike just in support for the government? That's another thing that we need to look at in grassroots movements, also looking both right and left and how they will behave. Thanks.
Feliciano, you've been researching on the figure of Donald Trump, of course, and what Trumpism means for different far-right movements around the world. But he's been gone for a while now, and we don't know yet if he's going to come back to a presidential race and so on. So how can Bolsonarismo, right, or this very far-right movement within Brazil survive or find inspiration without the figure of a Trump, in the White House?
Thank you, Carlos. Bolsonaro became the new Trump in Latin America. So I think this is a strand of research that we're exploring now. So I think other far-right movements in Latin America have survived without Trump because they relied on Bolsonaro as inspiration, role model, and possibly as a source of economic and political support. The case of Bolivia during the president of Janine Anines, 2019-2020, shows that Bolsonaro administration gave full economic and political support for a coup in Bolivia. Right? And Giannini was a conservative with several conservative movements similar to many others in Brazil, and they are very close together as well. So I think after Trump's defeat, Bolsonaro was the sole leader in all far-right movements in the region, from Venezuela to Bolivia and Uruguay. So Trump, in recognition of Bolsonaro's leadership in the case of the Geneva Consensus of 2021, functioned as a baton pass to Brazil. The Geneva Consensus, for those who don't know, it's a consensus among conservative governments against the discussion of abortion or human rights in general at the United Nations, right? So that was an initiative made by Trump. They invited Brazil to become a part. Brazil became a part, and after Trump lost, the Secretary of Family, equivalent to Secretary of Family of the United States, publicly said that if any other country wanted to know about how the initiative will go on, they should contact Bolsonaro's administration. So from there on, Bolsonaro became the leader of this movement worldwide. So the US conservative leader had chosen Bolsonaro as the new leader in one of the most critical foreign policy initiatives of the far-right movements worldwide, which is the fight against abortion at UN. But from a theoretical point of view, the literature still needs to understand the role of a global South leader in creating far-right global alliances and influencing other leaders, whether in the global South per se or in the North. We tend to have a top-down approach, which is the approach I use in my international affairs piece, understanding how far leaders in global South mimic northern countries' leaders by building similar political movements or foreign policy strategy once they are in power. Nevertheless, I think the case of Bolsonaro is symptomatic of a different causality line. That is, Bolsonaro is not only influencing other far-right leaders in Latin America, he was not only influencing them, but also in Europe. We have found evidence that Bolsonaro is very important in Portugal with the Chega party, which is led by André Ventura, and in Spain with the Vox party, led by Santiago Abascal, in Italy with the Fratelli d'Italia, led by Giorgia Meloni, and more importantly in Germany, with the Alternative for Germany, led by Beatrix von Storch. So all these leaders of the far right in Europe, they were looking up to Brazil and to Bolsonaro administration, not only to Viktor Orban in Hungary or Trump back then when Trump was in power, but Bolsonaro was important for that. So we need to also be trying to understand the role of a global South far right leader in creating these international alliances of far right movements. These parties on Europe tend to see Brazil as a country where religion and conservative values have not suffered the full attack of laicism and progressivism. So Brazil, for them, Brazil is still a beacon of hope, which is similar to what they think of the conservative movement in the United States. So and there is growing evidence that Bolsonaro influenced how far-right movements organize in the United States as well. More and more, we keep track of several conservative rallies in the United States, and more you see this, which is something that I never expected to see, is more and more mention of Brazil when Bolsonaro was in power, and you see more and more Brazilian flags, not only Israeli flags, but also Brazilian flags showing up on these rallies. You see Russian flags, which is unbelievable, but also Brazilian flags. So therefore, understanding the role of global South far-right leaders in northern countries must be explored further by the literature. And to answer your final question, final part of your question, what would happen to Latin American far-right movements in Trump, if Latin American far-right move, if Trump is reelected in 2024? I do not doubt that they will feel emboldened. They will acquire new strength in momentum. I also do not doubt that if Trump were the US president during the 2022 elections in Brazil, Bolsonaro would have much more strength to question the adverse election result. Trump's support for Bolsonaro could have created an impasse in Brazil. We could have created a problem toward the transition of power. On the other hand, Biden's support for the Brazilian electoral institutions and the threat to cut military agreements with the Brazilian army if they attempted any coup was critical to contain Bolsonaro's dreams of remaining in power. So another exciting research avenue is to understand counter alliances against far-right international alliances and coalitions. That is, facing a potential alliance between Trump and Bolsonaro, other far-right leaders, how democratic parties could create counter alliances with other democratic parties in different countries to counter the rise of far-right movement. This is something that I was not hoping to study, but as I was following the end of Bolsonaro's administration and all discussion in terms of foreign policy, I realized that there was an international alliance between the United States, Germany, France, Chile, Argentina, all in favor, like publicly going out and supporting Brazilian electoral court and the result of the election. So every time you have this alliance of far-right movements, you have a counter alliance, and you learn a lot from these counter alliances as well. But this connection between the two and how they react to each other has not been explored by the literature yet. So yeah, I think Trump is of course the significant other, as we say in the international affairs piece, for Bolsonaro, but Bolsonaro became the significant other for other far-right movements as well. And we need to understand that further. Thank you, Carlos.
I think that answered one of the final questions on the Q&A box, whether there are any far-right networks in Latin America. I think you've given plenty of examples on how these networks also travel to Europe and the US, for instance. There's another question on the Q&A by Ana de Melo, who's asking about whether the conservative identity politics might be on the rise, Andresa. But I think I would like to link that particular concept of conservative identity politics to violence. This could be physical or non-physical violence, but I think the angle of this webinar is whether these far-right movements can create or recreate any sort of violence. So what do you think, when I ask you generally and very broadly on the many meanings of violence in the literature, whether we'll see any violent movements in Brazil in the next years, Andresa? What's your first take on that?
Yes, I think this rollbacks of rights is always very violent, as you said, in the many means of violence, which doesn't have to be physical. But especially physical violence, I think, tends to emerge. We have seen that towards some minority religions, burning out temples of faith that is non-Christian. We have seen that against LGBTQ plus groups. We have seen lots of violence against women in general in Brazil. And I don't think this is a trend that may diminish. I think what becomes different is this idea that this is now the way the Brazilian society can behave. I think because with Bolsonaro, some of this violence became legitimized, and he himself defended some of these perpetrators of violence. Now this institutional backup of violence is no longer there, but doesn't mean that some of this won't happen in Brazilian society. I think Brazil has a history of violence against minorities, and it takes time to revert this. So I think we're still going to see this happening.
Thank you, Andresa. I would like to follow up with that with you, Feliciano, because you mentioned José Antonio Cast in Chile, and you also mentioned Javier Milei in Argentina. But clearly, the combination here was a critical juncture in which violence was allowed, right? So if we go back to the events of the insurrection in Brasilia, violence was allowed, right? The security forces stepped aside. Then with the Chilean Spring back in the late 2019, there were also expressions of violence allowed in both camps, in the very left and in the very right. But in Argentina, we still don't see anything on how Javier Milei might become a very far-right, violent type of candidate at all. He's just been, a candidate with a conservative agenda. So how do you think these critical junctures in terms of now is the time, to become violent, will be increasing or decreasing in Latin American politics?
This is a very good question, Carlos. I will speculate on that. From what I read and from what I'm studying, I think there's a difference between Brazil and Chile and other Latin American countries, and that's why Argentina is different. So we have to realize that in Brazil in particular, in Chile I also think is the same, and I'm not 100% sure, is that the military and the police military are very important actors of far-right movements, right? It's not the case in Argentina. In Argentina, the military after the Malvinas War and after the dictatorship, they were punished and they were changed, they were democratized. So the civilian power has full control of the military in Argentina. You don't see a single military in Argentina, a single policeman that either became a House deputy or a senator, and it has a very strong conservative agenda in the Congress. In Argentina, they managed to eliminate this sort of threat after a terrible experience that Brazil and Chile also experienced, now maybe with the same level in Argentina, but also experienced, and we didn't manage to get rid of this type of violence and the legitimation of this type of violence over time. So that's one of the going back to what Dr. Andressa said, that's one of the main challenges for us now, is because it's obvious that the military forces in Brazil, we have to remember in Brazil, we have the military. The military is really, I mean, it's a 210 million inhabitants. We have a 360,000 standing army, plus, I don't know how, 50,000 for the Navy and 50,000 for the Air Force. And we have 2.2 million military police. So every state has a military police. The military police is separated from the civil police. The civil police is responsible for investigation, and the military police was redesigned by the military dictatorship to control the population. So the violent police of Brazil you see on the news is the military police, right? And they are a subsidiary force of the army, and they have similar way of trainings, similar ideology. They're different, they're not all the same, they're similar ideology. And these groups were key for Bolsonaro administration. Bolsonaro couldn't govern without the army. One of the challenges of Lula administration now is to also almost 6,000 military working for the federal administration that are still working for the federal administration, right? Because Bolsonaro didn't have a very broad coalition, didn't have many people to work once he won the election. So he started calling people from the army. We're in the barracks, we're in the army headquarters. They were like doing military stuff, and now they're put in to run the health policy in Brazil. The terrible health policy that we had during the COVID-19 pandemic was run and controlled by the army. One of the reasons was so terrible. So this is something that is it makes Brazil a little different from the rest of other far-right movements worldwide, which is the role of the military, the connection between Bolsonaro and these groups. One of the main challenges of Lula is how the military, the standing army, the army of Brazil, will react or will be controlled by the Workers' Party. Today, they're all over the news in Brazil. This audio of the current army general, the #1 army general of the army. He was 15 minutes audio, and he was trying to convince his peers that Lula's victory was a true victory. I mean, he actually won. We don't like this guy. We hate this guy. This guy is awful, all corrupted, but this guy, he was obviously against Lula, but he was at least trying to say, no, this is the final result. We have to accept it. And the majority of the people, they're all generals, they don't want him. They don't want Lula in power. So how are you going to deal with them? Are they going to follow all Lula's orders? Or they're going to follow now and just wait for the Lula administration to get weakened for some economic reason or political reason to reenact all the Bolsonaro's typical strategies. And if now the investigations of the January of the insurrection is showing more and more military from the army, the Air Force, and the Navy, they were like without their, of course, the uniforms, but they were there on the streets, attacking their own palace, the palace, the government, the president, and the Supreme Court in Brazil. So this is one of the Lula's most difficult challenges. There is not a single general in Brazil who is leftist, not a single one. They fight against each other because the more far-right military in Brazil, they call the less far-right military in Brazil watermelon, because they're green outside and red inside. It's a melancia, which is the word in Portuguese. But they're all right-wingers. There is not a single one, and they are like that because all military academies in Brazil are ultra-conservative. The way they train and they teach the military in Brazil. The Workers' Party many times trying to change their curriculum and even intervene in the schools is for them. This is they will never accept that. They'll do everything in their power to not have any intervention in that. So they will continue to generate younger generals, colonels, captains who are far-right leaders and who believe now, after Bolsonaro administration, that they can, that they can be politicians as well, that they have a role to govern Brazil. After all, they governed Brazil for 21 years in dictatorship. So this is one of Brazil's main challenges. It is one of the most important ingredients for the continuing violence in Brazilian society. Thank you.
Thank you, Feliciano. That was a great analysis of, civil relations and the role of security actors. I think I would like to use probably the final 5 minutes before I hand over to Jessica to close the webinar, and asking you about, the elephant in the room whenever we talk about IR and global movements, which is the war in the Ukraine and the relation that Latin American countries had with Russia. For instance, one of the final trips of Jair Bolsonaro was to meet with Vladimir Putin. So, Andresa, in just maybe a minute and a half or two, how have you seen the effects of the war in terms of, siding parts, and has it had any echo on far-right movements in Brazil?
Oh, well, I think as a scholar, I should really pass this for Feliciano, because the responsibility of speaking with knowledge and backed by data prevents me, Carlos, from answering this one, because this is really out of my research agenda. And I really would like to learn from Feliciano what he thinks. I guess if this was, I know this is quite an informal panel, but I'm still speaking, as a scholar, and I've not studied this at all. And so if you forgive me, I'll pass this to Feliciano.
No, I answer anything. It doesn't matter. I'll give an answer. Don't worry.
Well
great
done.
answer, Feliciano.
No, thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Dr. Andresa. Andresa is doing the right thing, which is speaking based on a research agenda. Fortunately, I've been actually, because I study foreign policy, I've been following what's going on with the position of Brazil towards Ukraine and the Ukrainian war. Where I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago in Germany about that, specifically about Brazil's position concerning the war in Ukraine and the changes from Bolsonaro to Lula administration. So what we saw during Bolsonaro, to summarize, is that Bolsonaro's created what my friend Davison Lopes calls ambiguity by design. So when the first discussion was put to the floor about the Ukrainian war at the United Nations Security Council, Brazil voted, or it couldn't vote, but it supported the resolution that was going to condemn Russia's invasion. But on the other hand, Bolsonaro, as you said, Carlos, a couple of weeks before, like a couple of days before the war started, visited Vladimir Putin and apparently made a deal about the Brazil fertilizers. We have to remember that if Germany and Europe used to rely on Russian gas, Brazil relies on Russian and Belarus fertilizers. We are the third largest producer of food in the world, and we don't produce enough fertilizer, especially potassium, for the agriculture production. So we have to import from Russia. We missed many window of opportunities in the past to mine the potassium that we have in Brazilian ground. That is more than enough that we need, but we never did that. So we rely on that. So the idea of Bolsonaro was to have this ambiguity. It was a position in between. So we're gonna condemn the invasion, but we're not gonna support the sanction against Russia. We're not going to support the struggle of Ukrainians against Russians. We're going to say that this is too far away. All we need is to keep the fertilizers line functioning. So that happened, right? It actually happened. Brazil continues to import fertilizers from Russia, and it's paying Russians normally all this time. When Lula started, Lula has a different view of world affairs. And I forgot to mention one of the awesome. And that goes back to the all far right movements discussion, is that Bolsonaro admires Vladimir Putin because it's a strong politician, has all this macho style, that they love. I don't know why they like this. And also is a politician who was elected, but then managed to never leave power. right? He created this system, and he always wins the elections. So this is the dream of Bolsonaro, to have a Putin-style administration, which is the government is concentrated in him. He was never smart enough or powerful enough to do that in Brazil. He will never do that. Brazil has much more, many more checks and balances that will never happen, and difficult to that to happen. But that also would help. It helped Bolsonaro to have a closer relationship with Putin. Putin also recognized that there are some very weird lines between the two that if you read, you'll be like, I can't believe the president of Brazil is saying this kind of stuff. But when Lula started his administration, everything changed. Lula has a different view. He doesn't admire Putin at all, but he's more into the BRICS discussion. So he thinks that a defeated Russia will not be in Brazil's interest. An imperialist Russia is not in Brazil's interest either. So the invasion itself is horrible for the Ukrainians, it's terrible for the world, but it's also really bad for Brazil. Even being so far is bad for Brazil. Brazil wishes that the war never happened, because of course it's not something that is positive in any way. But he thinks that Brazil should get closer. Lula thinks that despite this BRICS, this closeness with the BRICS, he thinks that Brazil should get closer to the United States and Ukraine. Brazil voted in favor of the resolution last week, right? Just a couple of days ago, condemning the invasion. Brazil was invited by Zelensky, invited Lula to visit Ukraine. I'm not sure. I don't think Lula will go. We don't know. It was a very important issue discussed between Biden and Lula when Lula visited Biden 2 weeks ago. It's likely to be a very hot topic for the China visit in March 28th. But Lula positions himself as a peacemaker, right? He wants to participate in any, as he calls, a club of friends, peaceful friends. They will try to narrow down to come up with a peace treaty or any sort of a cease of hostilities between the parties. This is unlikely to happen in the war, but Lula has this, let's say, personal perspective. I don't know. I'm not sure if Brazil is able to do any good or to help much, but he has this is a different perspective for what Bolsonaro was. But we can never ask Brazil either to side totally with Russia or side totally with Ukraine. That will never happen, regardless of the administration in Brazil. We always have this in-between position, and sometimes we'll be closer to Ukraine and the United States, as we see now, Lula, but tomorrow we can change to be a little closer to Russia. Depends on the circumstances, right?
Thank you,
I know
Feliciano.
this is very frustrating, but this is what happens.
Thank you, Feliciano. I'll have to say bye-bye, and thank you so much to Andresa and to Feliciano, and pass over to Jessica, who I'm sure has a few more questions, and she'll be closing this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. We booked poor Carlos back to back on webinar, so he has to run to another one. But I wonder sort of if I have a couple of questions of my own to fill the last few minutes here. Andres, I wonder if I could ask you a question. I also studied quite a bit of the gender dynamics, and something that we've realized in looking at different global contexts, that there's obviously very different local contexts to the far right elements in these different countries. And Brazil is different than South Africa and the US, but they have common narratives often that revolve around anti-feminism, anti-LGBTQ+, that machismo, the misogyny that runs through these narratives is often sort of a linking element. And I don't know if you've seen any of that in sort of looking at the politics of Bolsonaro, but also sort of how that is feeding into the far right. If you've seen any of that influence being exported or imported from other contexts as well, other global contexts.
Thank you, Jessica. I feel that your last question should have been the first, just because we are now out of time, and this is such a very interesting debate. And it's a great question. I just want to leave here 2 points that we can reflect on. One is obviously anti-feminist agenda that I mentioned a bit, that was very strong during Bolsonaro's administration. But the second one, which is very interesting, is this women empowerment that happened during Bolsonaro administration, but with this very strong role of women, this very strong idea of what a woman should be like and what being a woman means. And this was personified by his wife, Michele Bolsonaro, which was really not that women don't have a role, like also Damares, his minister for the family, was also a very strong character in his government. So it's not disempower women at all. It's just what role women have, and that is to be very well defined in society. So Bolsonaro's administration had this, it's not even an ambiguity, or it's complex, because in a way, Michele Bolsonaro had a lot of power, for example. And so one of his main ministers had a lot of power as well. But a power to define women's role that is still behind a man, or is still to support men. But in that sense, it's still a very strong role if we have to think about this complexity. And what these women saying this in their own words is that they are not feminist, but they're feminine. And it's this very feminine aspect of womanhood, of womanness, that they're trying to pass on to society. So that was one interesting, complex aspect in Bolsonaro's administration. I think people studying the role of Michele Bolsonaro in his campaign and in politics will need to dive into these issues of gender, and people studying Damares Alves also will really need to pay attention to that, because at the same time that she defends, you know, the separation between male sphere and female sphere, she's also this very strong political character, and one of Bolsonaro's ministers that was never challenged, and won a Senate seat just now. Thank you.
It's really interesting, and it's a dynamic that I find fascinating, sort of the perceptions of the roles versus the reality of the roles that people take up. And I think that's true across far right organizations. I wonder, just to put sort of, if you can have a 1 minute wrap up, either one of both of you, Feliciano, we can come to you first, but just sort of thinking about the context of what's been going on in Brazil, and sort of, do you think this will echo? Will it have a more far-reaching impact? Will it be a problem to look for in the future? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Just sort of a last thoughts about what's happening and the nature of sort of radical right or far right in Latin America.
Thank you, Jessica. I think for Brazil, this is the question of the moment, is how big is going to be the Bolsonaro movement and the far right after they lose an election. I think Dr. Andressa mentioned a couple interesting aspects that they might be less radicalized now. They might be a little bit more strategic. Maybe their numbers are just inflated, because it's not that they got 50-something million votes in the last election, but maybe not all 50 million votes they think exactly like Bolsonaro thinks in terms of all issues, the role of the women, the role of social movements and all that. Maybe a bulk of these people just are anti-workers' party, and they don't like Lula, and they voted for Bolsonaro because they hated Lula more. So this is something yet to be seen. We can never forget that Bolsonaro, although he lost the election, the national election, his political party became the largest political party in the Congress, the PL, the Liberal Party. Damares Alves, as Dr. Andressa mentioned, is a senator. She's running to become I don't think she will win, but she wants to become the president of the International Relations Committee at the Senate, which is a very important committee, and discusses all the matters of international affairs in Brazil. It has the capacity to check the foreign policy and check the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So this is something to be seen. So today they just filed this investigation committee on the January 8th. The far right, they want to investigate what happened. So as a Congress investigation to investigate themselves in a way to come up with a different narrative to say they actually are more victim of the military apparatus than they actually are the perpetrators of the violence. So this is something yet to be seen. But I think will all depend on how good is the performance of Lula administration. If the economy in Brazil does well, if the economy grows, if the unemployment goes down, if the poverty reduces, we have to remember that 70 million Brazilians have problem with feeding. They are not totally hungry, but they are sometimes hungry. So They have a very problematic social situation. So if these things improve in Brazil in the next 4 years, so it's less likely that the far right will rise. So it's yet to be seen. They have power, but maybe we're overestimating their power as of now.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really interesting point, Stuart, how much it fluctuates with what's happening with other issues feeding into the potential power of these groups. Andresa, do you want to give a 1 minute wrap up to what your thoughts are on this issue as well?
I think I will pass, Jessica. It's just like so complex, everything for 1 minute.
Yeah.
And I think what I'd like to wrap up by saying is that, as Professor Feliciano has mentioned, we have about like 50 days of government. We have seen some interesting things happening, such as now with natural disasters in São Paulo, that an oppositional governor and President Lula joined forces to really solve like emergency aspects in São Paulo because of heavy rain and landslides. And we really need to see what happens institutionally and how some of the right-wing platforms may, diminishing power and may be more emptied. What happens in formal politics, such as Professor Feliciano mentioned, like some Damaris Alves elected senators with Sérgio Moro in the Senate, and a very right-wing, political sphere in Brazil, and what happens on the streets. I think this is beginning to unfold, as we say in Brazil. The year starts after Carnival, and Carnival just ended. So it's almost like 1 week of administration, if we count after Carnival. And I think we really need to see how these different forces of civil society, formal politics will, move on. But definitely, I think Brazil is today a case to following right-wing politics nationally, like for those studying Brazil, but also for those studying the movement internationally. I said I would not say much, and I'm saying much.
No, it's really, I think you're both raising great points to look to sort of the dynamics that will feed into either the potential growth of this or maybe the minimization of their power in the Brazilian context and in Latin America more widely. It's certainly something that we've been looking at with our far right program, sort of looking at these different locations around the world where perhaps often the conversation centers around the far right in Western Europe or in North America, but I think these dynamics of South America, of South Africa, other places around the world that are also struggling with potential far right problems. It's all very connected via these international, transnational lines of communication and narratives. So I think I've learned a lot. I thank you to both of you for your insights. It's really been a useful conversation, and thank you to Carlos, even though he's gone. We really are enjoying doing these webinars. And if to the audience, thank you for your questions. If you've enjoyed it, our next one will be scheduled soon, and it will be looking at the financing of far right. So looking more to some of the questions around financing of far right and what can be done about it. So I'll say thank you again to both of you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And everyone have a